Welcome everyone to Security Magazine's Cyber Video Podcast, sponsored by Cyjax. Today, on my right is Lisa Forte, and on my left is Philip Ingram, and we have a lot to talk about, don't we, Phil?
Oh yeah, a hell of a lot to talk about. The world is quiet at the moment, so people are going to have to just put up with what we want to say.
Well, we're going to kick it off with our first war, or as we're going to call it, the old war, which is Russia, Ukraine, back and forth over the territory grabbed in 2014, trying to right some historic wrongs. We're going to break it down into two sections. We're going to get an update from Phil on what exactly is happening on the ground, and then we're going to open this up and talk a little bit about the role that cyber's played in that conflict to date, but also think about what it may do in the future. So Phil, fill us in on where we're at.
Well, on the ground, we have got two counteroffensives going on at the moment. The Russians have just launched a counteroffensive in the area of Advika. They've done that after receiving 1,000 container loads of ammunition and equipment from North Korea. And they are not progressing well at all. They're trying to encircle this town that has been a hub of Ukrainian defenses since Russia's original invasion in 2014. But the Ukrainians have been blunting any of their advances, and the Russians are resorting to waves of human power going forward and just being slaughtered. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are continuing their counteroffensive around Bakhmut and are advancing slowly. And also down in the Zaporizhia Oblast, again advancing slowly as they try to get in and split that land bridge between Crimea and Russia. And they've also just opened up a little bit of a bridgehead. They've got at least a couple of naval infantry companies across the Dnipro down in the southern Kherson Oblast, but on the Russian-occupied side, and that's causing the Russians a little bit of a dilemma. Whilst Ukrainians make slow progress in their tactical advances on the front lines, they're pinning down a lot of the Russian reserves. They're continuing to hit them in the rear areas, and they've just got US ATACMS missiles. The first successful attack has gone in and hit two airfields with a lot of Russian aviation helicopter assets, destroying at least 14 aircraft, and that will have a significant impact on Russia's ability to prosecute its tactical operations.
So that's the state of play. And I mean, one of the big stories was Ukraine got dangerously close to sinking the Russian Black Fleet, except for one individual who I think bridges the gap between cyber disinformation and outright intervention in this particular war. Of course, we're talking about Elon Musk. Shutting off the satellites just as Ukraine was getting close with their sea drones, which apparently rely on an internet wireless type of signal. Some thoughts about, Lisa, about how one person can affect such a large impact in the war?
I think it comes down to something which affects basically everyone in every company, and that's having a single point of failure is a really big vulnerability. And yes, obviously there's a lot of anger towards Elon Musk. This is a lot of anger towards Elon Musk, full stop, to be perfectly honest. But again, it's just if you have one single point of failure that your whole operation would be shut down if X happened, that's not a resilient mindset, that's a mistake. And that's the same if you're a company relying on one service. It's the same if you're an individual. It's the same if you're a country.
And with Musk, X happened. He changed Twitter into X.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it was fascinating, though, because another story that came out of there, which was straight out of a James Bond movie, was infiltration into the Crimean Peninsula by commandos on Sea-Doos, navigating their way ashore and conducting what type of operation, Phil?
Yeah, well, those are your special forces raiding operations, complementing the special operations executive type operations that are ongoing anyway. The Ukrainians have taken a lot of the tactics that were used during the Second World War. They've got their special operations people operating throughout Russia, throughout Crimea, in the occupied parts of Ukraine, destroying railway lines, derailing trains as they're going along, helping to target missile attacks into headquarters, passing information and intelligence back. And then you get good old commando raids, and that was a commando raid. It went in and attacked a Russian S-400 anti-aircraft missile site, that then left part of the Crimean Peninsula wide open for it to be exploited by Ukrainian missile capability coming in and attacking the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. And then we've seen the attacks against the Black Sea Fleet ships as well. So Ukraine is playing, they're giving us a masterclass in what, from a military perspective, you call multi-domain operations. And they're bringing out a lot of capabilities and using a lot of tactics that we haven't seen since the Second World War.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting kind of segue, if you will, to talk a little bit about the cyber, Lisa, in that whole campaign. Overall, I think it's fair to say that NATO has been massively supporting the Ukraine. We have a second story that we're going to be talking about, how maybe some of the resources might end up being dragged away from the Ukraine. But, what are some of the major sort of points that you've seen from the Russian threat actor perspective, and their activity in support of Russian objectives?
Yeah, so you had, obviously, the most significant thing I think we saw was the Killnet/Anonymous Sudan attack on Microsoft, which I think took us all by surprise because the amount of resourcing you would need to pull that off in the way that they did was worrying. We hadn't really seen that before. Microsoft, those particular services were taken offline, which requires a huge amount of resourcing that, okay, you could start saying has got to come from the state. Maybe it didn't. Who knows? But I definitely showed the level of capability in their hacktivist groups was actually a lot higher than we thought. I also think we saw them attacking European financial institutions as well, and they gave obviously very public warnings. It's in their interest to give public warnings because obviously what they're trying to do is not make money. We know Killnet is predominantly funded by crowdfunding operations, so money is not their objective. It's to take people offline, deface websites, things like that. And again, they took the European Investment Bank offline. And again, it's about applying pressure, I think. And the attitude in the countries that are funding Ukraine, I think the goal for groups like Killnet and Anonymous Sudan is to sow a level of fear or disgruntlement in the population to put pressure on the government to cease funding. And I think that's ultimately the goal.
So do you think as we settle into the second winter, really, of the war in Ukraine, Phil, do you feel that although it might stagnate on the ground, there will be an increase in attacks, G20 nations that have shown support for Ukraine over the winter period?
Very much so. And I don't think it's down to just the winter. If we look at what else is happening from a geopolitical perspective, we've got the US presidential elections coming up. We've got elections coming up in the UK. There will be other elections across Europe and elsewhere.
Are you going to suggest that the Russians are going to be meddlesome in those?
They have no history of that.
No, I'm not going to suggest it. I'm going to say it blatantly. They will be meddling as much as possible, but this is where they'll be using cyber to influence as many different industries to cause financial pain, to cause pain that will have a longer-term economic impact and political destabilization impact in different countries. They'll use it to do the classic of deny service to something, steal the data that's there, and use that data then to exploit and influence what's going on in elections and influence individuals.
So that in Slovakia. I mean, Slovakia has just elected their new government that's incredibly sympathetic to Russia.
Yeah, and Russia's got an active program of doing that. If someone asked me a direct question, did Russia interfere in the last US presidential elections and try and get Trump across the line? Hell yes. Yeah. Did Russia get involved in trying to influence the Brexit referendum in the UK? Of course they did.
Well, hold on there, Phil. The government has not exactly revealed that confidential report on Russian influence. So
I haven't seen anything. This is my opinion, but I'd love someone to prove me wrong.
I know, exactly. So we're in this interesting scenario where we now have a war that's almost approaching 700 days. I think at last count it was in the 680s.
No, we're I think today is 605.
Yeah.
605. Okay.
It was the 24th of February.
My mistake. It's approaching a 2-year anniversary.
Yeah.
What do you think we'll expect in the summer? Do you think, Russia is going to finally run out of military resources, or do you feel like it will never be slow grinding campaign?
Well, I think Russia is running out of military resources at the moment, and that's why they're reliant on the resupply from North Korea. North Korea industrial base, they've got huge stocks, but their reliability is not good. And as they start to manufacture more, their reliability is going to go downhill. I would not want to put a North Korean piece of ordnance into anything that I'm going to be standing beside when someone pulls the trigger or pulls the lanyard to make it go bang, because it's more likely to go bang in your own piece of equipment than it is whenever it's fired out the barrel. And that's an indication of just how bad a position Russia is in. So I think what the Ukrainians will do throughout the winter months is they'll continue and increase their special operations type activity. They'll increase the activity across Crimea. They'll increase their shipping operations in Russia's rear areas. And therefore, we could see the Kerch Bridge attacked again. We'll see railway hubs attacked. We'll see airfields attacked again. And they've now got the wherewithal to do that with ATACMS complementing the Storm Shadow and the French equivalent, the Scalp missiles that are going in. There is nowhere that is out of range, nowhere inside the geographic areas of Ukraine that's been formally identified pre-2014 by the international community. There's nowhere that Ukraine cannot reach and influence now. That is significant. Russia will be scared. Complementing all of that, we will see a massive increase in Russia trying to carry out wider cyber operations and influence operations, not just hitting at the elections, but hitting at everything else that's going on across the globe. And of course, we've got another war that we're probably going to talk about.
We're probably going to talk about
I think
that.
also there's the announcement from Kazakhstan that happened this week.
Which is significant.
Which is really significant. And I know that they've been a bit of a pain in Russia's side since the beginning of this. I remember the president making a statement saying that, this is a warning that Russia could come and invade Kazakhstan any moment, sort of thing. But to basically put a prohibition on 106, was it? Or 100, it was over 100 things.
Different things.
That involved resources that Russia needed from Kazakhstan that get manufactured in Kazakhstan. And the lease is coming up on Baikonur. Which is going to be interesting because relations are not good between Kazakhstan and Russia.
That's the spaceport.
That's the spaceport. That is how Russia completely operates its Soyuz and space capacity. If that were to be, I guess from the Kazakh side, if they refused to renew that lease, that would be...
nationalised by Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan takes over all of the space launches.
Yes.
Elon Musk, you've got competition.
It's interesting.
I support that.
Exactly.
It's interesting to me to see a little bit of backbone from traditional allies of Russia, who I think, because they were sort of had that PTSD from the Cold War era, thought of Russia as being, this iron fist. Yeah, this. If we don't do what the Russians tell us to do, there is no option. Every sign is a Russian sign. I think now, because of the atrophy of the Russian sort of military, the fact that they're taking some 1960s, 1950s ordnance and putting it into military operations, do you think we'll see a trend of the stands, if you will, sort of backing away from Russia?
Definitely. And when he called that meeting of the group of countries that would traditionally go, I can't remember what the group is called, but there's a group that's mainly Central Asia and then the Georgia, Azerbaijan region. Yeah. And many of them didn't attend, which was really significant. Azerbaijan has been a real pain in Russia's side. They immediately from the start of the war actually put a no-fly zone for all Russian military vehicles, which was a pain because they were getting loads of stuff from other areas in that region that would have to fly.
Yeah, they're kind of in the middle there.
Yeah, and they were like, no, it's a no-go zone. So again, I think, like you said, they saw Russia as this sort of big protecting kind of force. Maybe a little bit of fear in that as well, and over-dependency. This happens, they realize they can do trade deals with Europe, they can do trade deals with China, they can do trade deals with other countries, India and other countries. Actually, we don't really need Russia as much as we thought. So I think their sphere of influence has contracted significantly.
And the other thing, from a pure defence perspective, I think they've seen the vulnerabilities that there are in Russian kit they all bought it beforehand. Russia has got a fantastic marketing capability, saying our kit does this and does the best and does the rest of it. The Russians can't even get their T-14 Amata tanks to get out and deploy inside Ukraine, and their modern T-90s that are supposed to be invulnerable to NLAW Block 1 are emulating the Soyuz spacecraft, but with their turrets taking off whenever an NLAW Block 1 hits the turret. And this is where people are realizing that actually there's a lot of bluff behind what they've been saying from a technical perspective and their quality standards and their industrial base. And I think the stands will now be looking at other suppliers for their defense equipment because they realize that actually they're really vulnerable by relying on Russian kit.
Yeah.
Within the region, though, I think one of the Russians' plans is going to be trying to destabilize as many sort of sympathetic Russian groups or governments in the region to take the pressure off.
Yeah.
Now, we're going to put a check mark in Russia because it turns out in the new war between Israel and Hamas, and arguably the Palestinian people themselves. That's we'll get into that.
I disagree with that,
But I think one of the fundamentals is that Russia has now realized that there's an opportunity to play a pretty major role in Middle East politics. So I think what we'll do is we'll get the quick synopsis from Phil, who I believe has been on television a few times talking about this very new war.
Have I?
Yes. Let's bring us up to speed on what's going on so far.
Well, it's just coming up to 2 weeks from the horrendous Hamas terrorist attack into southern Israel that has killed, I think the death toll is up to 1,500 Israeli people and captured 199 individuals, where they've taken them back into Gaza as hostage. And the Hamas terrorists who went into Israel, a large proportion of those have been killed or have gone back into Gaza. Israel then immediately mobilized 350,000 of its reserve forces, and all of its regular forces have started preparing for a ground attack into Gaza. They've stated a very clear aim that they want to eradicate Hamas completely. Aligned with this, they recognize that there's a polarization, not just across the Middle East, but across the world, and that polarization is causing other groups that are anti-Israeli to stand up, in particular Lebanese Hezbollah on the southern Lebanon border. So Israel has put a large proportion of its mobilized force and its regular force and heavy armor up in its northern border with Lebanon to try and dissuade Hezbollah coming in. And we're just in a round of political visits from the Quint nations, that's US, UK, Germany, France and Italy, trying to keep a track on and influence Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel so that he will maintain a close approximation to international law as they attack into Gaza, because the only way that you're going to be able to have any chance of destroying Hamas is by going in the ground, and that is going to be big and difficult. There's a real potential for wider Middle East countries to get involved, and this then to spread to create another wider Middle East war, and that combined with what's going on in Ukraine could set the conditions for a world war. The US are so concerned about this that they have deployed not one but two carrier battle groups into the Eastern Mediterranean by way of a warning to other nations, effectively to say, do not get involved. Let Israel sort this out with Hamas. You stay back and do not get involved militarily. Otherwise, we've got a big stick and we'll come and hurt you very hard with it. And we saw last night US ships in the Gulf region shooting down missiles that were potentially coming from, I think, the Houthis. I may have got that wrong.
Right. No, that's
heading towards Israel. So it's already a wider regional security issue that's there, being watched very closely indeed. The coming few weeks are going to be very telling. But in the old doomsday clock towards global destruction, I would say if we were going to analyze it again today, it's clicked a few seconds closer to midnight.
I want to talk about the hacktivist activity.
I was just going to ask you, has anybody done anything online in response to this?
I've been following this, and it's been really, really interesting because unlike the Russia-Ukraine thing where we saw things bubbling for a long time, even prior to Russia's invasion. I mean, Russia have never been like, oh, no, we don't do cybercrime. You know, it's been a tenet of their kind of what they do. But this was really interesting because on the Saturday when the attack happened, when the Hamas attack happened, we saw pro-Palestinian groups, so hacktivist groups in Indonesia, I think the Moroccan Black Cyber Army, who are another hacktivist group based in Morocco, unsurprisingly, or poorly named, one or the other. They went and they attacked a load of Israeli companies and in particular targeted Israeli newspapers and media outlets, shutting off, like DDoSing them and taking them offline on that day when the Hamas attack happened, which was quite significant. Then the next day, we saw the Indian Cyber Force, who are a really big hacktivist group. They started attacking Palestinian organizations. They took offline telecoms. They took offline other businesses within Palestinian control. What was really interesting was the main Palestinian hacktivist group, which I think is called Anonymous Ghost or a non-ghost, they then attacked the Indian government websites and Indian key businesses and DDoSed them, which brought India involved, whether they wanted to be or not. We're talking about it escalating, right? This is, hacktivist groups operating off their own initiative, I suppose, and bringing governments who maybe wouldn't have got involved, bringing them into a discussion at least, because this is a problem. I think one of the most significant acts by hacktivists for me was the Anonymous Ghost attack on the Red Alert app, which is the Israeli missile alert app that people have. And they exploited a vulnerability in that, and they worked out that they could send fake warnings to Israeli citizens. So sending loads of those, and they were sending like nuclear bomb threats and stuff, which obviously eroded the level of trust that Israeli citizens had in that app and what they were reading, which...
That's significant.
Significant. And then, this is all in 2 weeks. We've seen Iranian groups such as Cyber Avengers, who are a big Iranian hacktivist group. They went after the Dorad power station, I think it was called, an Israeli power station anyway. And that action caused the Arvin Club, who are like hacktivist ransomware groups, to attack Iranian facilities. So as you can see, all these countries, these hacktivist groups, decide they're going to get involved and, influence the outcome. And that inevitably drags their governments into a conflict that they were not going to be involved in, off the bat at least. And it's really, really concerning.
So in the cybersphere, we've already got that escalation across the wider Middle East and bringing in other influences in the Middle East, which is extremely worrying. I think there's another bit that whenever they do the analysis of how Israel managed to miss the preparations that Hamas were doing for over a year, I think what you'll find is that Hamas understood Israel's ability to be influenced online and through communications and everything else, and will have had an active campaign of feeding Israel through means that they knew Israel was gathering from intelligence purposes what they thought Israel wanted to hear about Hamas not planning anything from a military perspective, concentrating on looking after things from a governmental perspective in Gaza and everything else, which is why Israeli intelligence effectively said, Gaza's fine, there's not a problem in there, the big problem is Hezbollah, and we'll concentrate on what's going on there. And that's where their intelligence machinery was focused, and it was reinforcing the groupthink that there will have been in Israeli intelligence. And that's where I think when this is all finished and they do the final analysis of what went wrong in the very beginning, you'll find that people's preconceptions were being reinforced quite deliberately by Hamas and by those that were backing Hamas, because I think this is bigger than their capability, and there'll have been a lot more planning going on through other different nations that's there, because it's too sophisticated.
And I think can I just say, you touched upon the information and the influence operations. And I think one thing we've seen in this conflict, we have seen it a lot with Russia-Ukraine, but I think the level of misinformation being put out in this particular one is absolutely unprecedented.
To the point where Elon Musk was called by the EU to say, you have to do something about
Yeah.
this or we're going to fine the heck out of you.
Yeah.
And there was loads that came out. There was the ones that stick in my mind. There was the claim that Israel had just bombed an Orthodox church, and the video, if you haven't seen it, it's kind of a pulled out shot of Gaza. You can't really make out an awful lot. It's kind of grainy. It's not great, but you can see an explosion, right? You can't see what it hits. You can't really see the aftermath. You can't see any detail. But the caption says, "Oh my God, they just bombed a church." Bellingcat then looked at it, found the church's Facebook page, and the church had actually said, "We haven't been bombed, like we're fine, like this hasn't
We're all
happened." But it kind of went viral. And then the other one that I thought was really interesting, there's this horrible clip of this young girl who's been burned alive, right? And this clip actually is traced back to Guatemala in 2015. It's been used in almost every single conflict since that point, and it was being used again in this particular conflict where people were sharing it, saying like that this girl had been burned alive and how horrible it was. It's correct. They haven't been manipulated. These videos are correct.
Yeah.
But they've been taken out of context and put into a different conflict.
And trying to manipulate people. This is where the lesson that goes out to the general public, and it's something that the wider security community should do. We have to recognise that misinformation and disinformation is a security issue now, I would argue. And people have to rely on reliable sources, but they're not always reliable. We look at the headlines that came out after the attack on the explosion at the hospital in Gaza recently. That international press headlines turned around and said it was a result of an Israeli airstrike, basing that on a Hamas message on X/Twitter that came out within minutes of that explosion happening, and all the analysis afterwards tends to suggest that it was a missile that dropped short, being fired by the
Islamic
Jihad, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the damage is consistent with a fire from propellant, not damage from a massive explosion. This is all part of it, and people have to recognise that if you get fed something, the first thing that you see is probably wrong.
Yeah.
And that, from an intelligence perspective, and people know my background in that, the first report that you get in as a tipper that comes in and goes on the desk, when you look at it, you go, that doesn't quite fit. It's probably wrong. So what I do is I have what I call soak time. I put it in the pending tray, I go off and make a cup of tea, and I sit down and have my cup of tea and think about it again. And by the time I finish my cup of tea, there's usually another report that comes in and goes, "You were right to be skeptical about that.
Yeah.
We need to look at other things," and get your analysis. Instead of immediately reposting, re-putting out, and pushing that disinformation around, because you're part of the problem if you do that.
And you don't know, and it happens on both sides. It's happening, and I always say to people, like, the one that you're going to get caught out by is the one that you're most sympathetic to.
Yeah.
So in the Ukraine-Russia situation, which is perhaps a little bit less tense to talk about, I'm obviously pro-Ukraine, so anything that's coming out that's anti-Russian, or like, look how bad the Russians have been, and look at how awful they are, and look at this, like, that feeds totally into my bias.
Absolutely.
So I'm way more likely to buy that than I am anything the Russians put out. And it's same with this. Like, if you're like the Israeli propaganda that went out that showed these people coming down from the sky, and they claimed it was Hamas soldiers being dropped in Israel, and it was paragliders on holiday in Egypt.
Yeah, but it was used for a propaganda purpose.
Totally. And if you're on one side or the other, that's what you're going to buy, and you've got to be aware of that.
I think in my particular case, in my analysis, because I'm going to share some ideas with you guys right now, the antidote to bias is, I think, cynicism in this particular case.
Yeah, I agree.
I think one of the reasons
very
why
good.
disinformation is working so well on both sides is we're dealing with a very uneducated, very angry population of Palestinians and Arabs surrounding Israel. I think you have a major, almost biblical issue with the fact that there is no negotiation if you've already declared that the Israelis have no right to exist. So it's kind of hard to walk that one back with the angry mob. And honestly, I think the leadership of Hamas here needed to do something and needed to focus the anger of that mob away from their leadership. And so they gave them the idea that they could go into Israel in flip-flops and AK-47s and go up against one of the most prepared militaries that there is. But we had a great conversation, Phil, just before we started this about what the potential end game or opening chess move is, and I want to come back to that asterisk that we put around Russia as well, because I think this is key. But walk us through what you think the grinding battle that is going to take place as the Israeli forces enter Gaza, an area which has been preparing for this fight for 25 years, right? Is going to do in the larger sense of geopolitical stability.
Can I also add on a question for you to that, because I'm interested. What are the challenges of a ground offensive in comparison to how they'd normally deal
Let's go with that one first to give context to your big
I'm going to bring in something else first, because you talked about the polarization inside the Middle East countries that's there. If you look at the polarization that's coming out in the West and other countries around the world, where you're getting demonstrations in support of the Palestinian people, which is quite right, but there are large proportions of people who don't understand that Hamas do not represent the Palestinian people.
Correct.
Hamas have terrorized the Palestinian people as much as they have terrorized the Israelis, and therefore this fight against Hamas is not a fight against the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, Hamas will use the Palestinian people, the people in the Gaza Strip, as human shields, and that's where a lot of the casualties come in. Hamas wants to see buildings being dropped and women and children being carried out, because that suits their purpose, and therefore will ensure that they are there as Israel attacks into legitimate military targets.
That feeds the anger cycle.
Which feeds the anger cycle. Now, that anger cycle, and here's where I'll bring it into the Russian bits and all the rest of it, that anger cycle, as it's played out in Western countries, has got a greater potential to stimulate terrorist activity, like we saw with ISIS and homegrown in France and elsewhere. That will help refocus countries onto their counterterrorism issues. That is the sort of thing that the likes of Vladimir Putin loves, because it's causing further disruption that is causing Western countries not to focus on and support Ukraine and what's going on there. And there's a bigger bit. But going back to both of your questions, because I'll answer those together. Israel won't have gone in the ground at the moment because it's only 2 weeks since the terrorist attack. It takes a long time to get an army mobilized, get it equipped, even if it's permanently there, get it ready to go in and carry out a ground assault into somewhere where we know for the last 12 months Hamas has been preparing for this. So they will have prepared the conditions that they know where Israel's going to attack in through, and therefore Israel is attacking into a set ambush. It's already been put in there. And therefore it takes a long time to get your troops ready for that. And you're constantly balancing off that time of getting the preparation done against additional time that Hamas are using to get to understand what your plans are and increase their defenses. And once you become the tipping point in that balance, that's when Israel will go in. 2 weeks would be the minimum. I'd say 3 to 4 weeks is a much better planning time for Israel to go in the ground. You have to set clear objectives. We haven't heard what the clear objectives are at the moment, apart from their end state is the total destruction of Hamas. That's going to be exceptionally difficult, if not impossible to do. You can't do it from the air, so you have to go in the ground to do it. Hamas.
Sorry, why can't you do it from the air? I'm not from a military background, so I don't understand.
Because the only way to do it from the air would be to effectively nuke and kill everyone.
Okay.
And even then, you're unlikely to kill everyone in Hamas, because a lot of the defenses that Hamas have got are in the tunnel infrastructure that's under Gaza. Some of those tunnels are a couple of 100 feet deep, and therefore Hamas fighters will survive. They'll come up and get irradiated, but they still won't have been eliminated. So to get in and do it on the ground, you have to go in, hold the ground, control the people, deal with the threat that's there, eradicate that threat, and then whatever your plan is for after you've done that, you then bring that in. That isn't clear. What's the end state? What is Israel going to go in and occupy Gaza and do that? Is Israel going to go in, take out Hamas targets, and then withdraw and leave it as a vacuum, which will just be filled with
Islamic Jihad, the next
Hamas,
group of idiots,
Islamic Jihad, or whoever's going to take over, because someone else will take over. So they're not going to fix the overall problem. So we've got that. But once the Israeli troops go into the ground in Gaza, this is a long operation. So they're going to be fixed in there. They're going to have to be concentrating on that, and they're going to suffer large numbers of casualties. Unfortunately, the Palestinian people are going to suffer as well. What's going on? Once the Israeli troops get fixed in there, that reduces their overall military strength. That's when I would suspect Hezbollah will become more active on the southern Lebanon border, and they will force the Israeli military to be fixed in a second front, and looking at that. Once the Israeli military are fixed in those two fronts, I would then see the potential for Iran to try and stir up internal dissent in the West Bank amongst the Palestinian people. And there'll be a big information campaign suggesting that Israel's carrying out atrocities in the different areas and all the rest to try and stir that up, so that Israel's then got an internal security issue that is focusing their internal security organizations to have to deal with in a big way. That's three fronts that Israel is beginning to fight on. Then Iran would try and influence potentially Lebanon and Syria to use their conventional military forces to come down to potentially threaten, reinforce what Hezbollah are doing. Remember, Hezbollah and the Lebanese government are one together.
And they're much more sophisticated. Am I correct?
Hugely sophisticated and a lot larger, and they've got more conventional military capability. So they would come in. Who's supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria at the minute in their fight against ISIS? So we've got Vladimir Putin and Russia, and also who is Putin relying on for the supply of some of his military material?
Iran.
We've got Iran. Now, go back to Russia is now relying on Iran for ammunition and North Korea for ammunition. What do North Korea want and what do Iran want as potential payback for what they're going to supply? And as Putin gets further further defeated in Ukraine, he will want a greater support that's coming in. This is where those countries, North Korea is already a nuclear state, but it wants greater nuclear technology. Iran's desperate for nuclear technology. It wouldn't surprise me if very quickly we get into a position where Russia is having to use its nuclear assets,
one of the last cards in its deck,
as a bargaining chip to sell to or to give to Iran for support, and to give that technology further to North Korea to get its continued support. Because international sanctions mean that the ruble is tanking. Russia is still getting a lot of money through its oil revenue and everything else, but it'll have cash flow problems. It doesn't have nuclear material problems, and that's kicking a longer-term issue that's out there. This is the sort of thing that would further destabilize what's going on in the Middle East enormously. And who have we got bridging Ukraine and bridging the Middle East? Vladimir Putin sitting there watching.
I also think that this has another slight angle that's quite interesting. So Iran has a huge cyber capability, both at a national level and within their hacktivist APT groups, right? They're incredibly well-funded and sophisticated, probably one of the best in the world. And I think you touched upon how this could potentially be that ticker to doomsday, this World War III situation. This could be the first time in history, if we had a world conflict, I think, where America is not immune to attack. Because traditionally, America has been way over here.
Yeah.
Realistically, you can't hit them with anything particularly. They'll spot you coming. But for the first time in history, I think if you actually had Iran going up against the United States, American infrastructure could be under attack.
Well, they're already having success against U.S. infrastructure, and again, if you then combine from the hacktivist perspective, and let's throw out a wild ass assumption here that actually there's been a bit of wider planning at the top. There's no indication of this whatsoever, where Russia, Iran have sat down together and helped plan what's going on at the moment, and what we're seeing today is merely stage one of a much wider plan. And of course, Xi Jinping will be sitting there in the background trying to influence what's going on. The peacekeeper.
He's the international peacekeeper, I'll have you know.
But he could use that as an excuse to get in things. But then you bring the influence on the APTs that there is from the nation state perspective, and effectively they're one. They're one together. You've got that ability to attack into the United States, and the United States financial institutes, the financial institutes, the government institutes, the critical national infrastructure has been hit in the cyber world beforehand. To do it in a concerted way as part of a conflict.
And I don't think they're equipped to bounce back from it.
No, I don't think they are.
And I think that's real for the first, and that might moderate America's response. in this a little bit because
Or stimulated to be
Or
in
stimulated.
the physical world more extreme.
That I think is a really great point. So what we're going to do is we're getting down to the end of what appears to be a pretty bleak scenario.
it's not getting happier, is
Yeah,
it?
it's not getting happier. But I think when you think about World War II, when the United States entered, after the Pearl Harbor attacks,
Yeah.
they ramped up the military-industrial complex to a level that was massive and changed the game. Right?
Definitely.
We have a major problem in the United States with a very polarized political outlook. In fact,
Yeah.
one part of their government is frozen in this ongoing speaker battle. This makes America's response not like it dilutes it. I
Yeah.
think if every issue that the American people have to choose about comes down to partisanship, you won't get a consensus on should things get worse in Israel or should we suffer an attack on the homeland. What is going to be the American response? Everything is
Right.
politicized
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah.
And this is deeply problematic from the perspective of allies of the United States who always
yeah.
thought it would be there, to help you out and to have your back. I feel that the presence of the two carrier groups is to try and modify the Israeli response, which
think
is
so too,
bordering on the psychopathic pursuit of this terrorist organization of all costs. I think bringing in those 300,000 reservists or so is a huge hit to the Israeli GDP because those people won't be at work. They will
Correct.
be grinding it out on the ground.
Yeah.
We have the makings of an economic crisis on top of the other crises that we have. So I want to just kind of sum up now and say, Lisa, what are kind of the things that you're seeing in the hacktivist community over the short term, but also the longer term?
Yeah, I think the hacktivist groups will become more active. I think the more politicized, the more misinformation stirs up this hate, as you were talking about, the more we will see them get involved, the more they will drag other countries, hopefully not countries we don't want involved. I think that will inevitably happen. I also think the other problem that we have is social media platforms across the board have had huge layoffs in the last couple of years. They have almost no ability, in my opinion, to vet content now. Yeah. And as a result, they are a free-for-all. And that is going to become a huge problem and then put pressure on governments to act in ways that perhaps are not diplomatic or are, maybe inflate the conflict.
Phil, I'm gonna beg you to try and give us what does a good outcome look like? Can we get there?
Well, a good outcome will look like Israel achieving partial success in the destruction of Hamas, and then they will happily go for peace, and we'll get a two-state solution in Israel. I just want to leave the listeners with one cyber-related example. From a historical perspective, if we go back to the First World War, it was a deliberate denial of service attack that brought the Americans into the First World War. And we have to recognize the cyber dimension is a very powerful dimension. We didn't have cyber then, but that deliberate denial of service attack was the first aggressive action of the British in the First World War, was the cutting of four of five telegram cables coming from continental Europe out to the rest of the world. The fifth cable went through the UK. It had been tapped into, and the German High Command then had to go on to HF communications, using coded communications to communicate with their embassies around the world. The codes had been broken. What that resulted in was the intercept of the Zimmerman telegram, and the Zimmerman telegram was the instrument that was used whenever that got exposed. The Americans suggesting the Germans had agreed to carve up southern United States if Mexico invaded. That was what was used to bring the Americans into the First World War. The cyber dimension is very important and very influential when it comes to wider discussions. And I think your point about America being attacked directly is probably one of the most worrying things that there is in how all of these conflicts will develop.
Amazing. So I'd like to thank Lisa Forte and Philip Ingram, and a huge shout out to our sponsor, Cyjax, and of course our platform, Security Magazine.